Did you know that, despite being officially abolished, slavery still exists in the world? That's right. When we talk about slavery, most people immediately think of those scenes from period films, with slave ships crossing oceans and heavy chains binding legs and wrists. But the reality today, as bizarre as it sounds, still includes millions of people living in situations of extreme exploitation, without freedom of movement, subjected to forced labor, human trafficking, debt bondage, and even forced marriage. In some places, entire families are still treated as property, spending generations trapped in a brutal system. And the most shocking thing, this doesn't just happen in poor or isolated countries. Reports from international organizations show that modern slavery is present on practically every continent, often in disguised forms, such as immigrants having their passports confiscated or workers never being able to pay off forged debts. Today on Bello Mundo, we're going to explore some of the places where slavery, in one form or another, still persists. Number 1. North Korea. Let's open this list with a place that needs no introduction when it comes to repression and isolation. North Korea is often described as the most closed regime in the world, a country where almost everything is controlled by the state, from news to personal life. But apart from the authoritarian regime, what few people know is that there is something very similar to slavery. The most common form is forced labor imposed by the government. Every North Korean citizen goes through periods of compulsory service on farms, public works, or in factories, and this, in theory, could even be compared to military service in other countries. But in practice, the complaints indicate exhausting working hours, poor security conditions, insufficient food, and a regime of heavy surveillance, where any complaint can lead to jail or worse. Apart from that, there are also reports that the government exports North Korean labor to other countries, in construction or mining projects, and keeps most of the workers' wages, leaving them with practically nothing. According to estimates by the Global Slavery Index, around 1 in 10 of the country's inhabitants live in this situation, which is devastating. And what complicates everything is that there is no space to complain or go to court. The party calls the shots. Any human rights organization operates underground, at extreme risk. Escaping is not easy because the borders are mined and guarded, and if you are caught trying to escape, you run the risk of serious punishment. Number 2. Eritrea. Now, imagine a country that some call the North Korea of Africa. This nickname is no exaggeration. Eritrea, located in the Horn of Africa, has an authoritarian regime that traps its citizens in a national service with no expiration date. The scheme works like this. On turning 18, young people are drafted into the army. But it's not that military service that lasts 1 or 2 years. Here they can stay for decades with no prospect of being released. And in practice, they're not just training for the country's defense. They're forced to work in construction, plantations, government projects, and even factories. It's forced labor disguised as patriotism. To make matters worse, extreme poverty and repression make any protest impossible. Those who can flee. Thousands of Eritreans risk crossing deserts to Sudan, Ethiopia, and even the dangerous Mediterranean route. But flight does not mean freedom. Many end up in the wrong hands, forced into marriage, exploitation, or slave labor in other countries. And while all this is going on, the government keeps repeating that this national obligation is essential for the country's sovereignty. Laws against slavery, almost non-existent. Policies to protect workers, none. Any attempt to expose the situation is quickly silenced. In practice, Eritrea is a veritable black hole when it comes to human rights. There is no reliable information, no freedom of the press, And even worse, no sign of change on the horizon. Number 3. Mauritania. Now we land in Mauritania, a country on the border between North and West Africa that carries one of the most shameful titles in the world. It was the last country to officially abolish slavery in 1981. But abolition on paper didn't mean that the chains were really broken. There is still a system there called hereditary slavery. In a nutshell, if you are born into a family of slaves, your whole life is already determined. There is no choice, no pay, no rights. Many of these people belong to the Haratina ethnic group and are considered, in practice, the property of Arab Berber families, forced to work as servants or shepherds without any pay. And why does this still happen? Even after the supposed abolition, it took decades for the government to create laws actually criminalizing the practice. It wasn't until the year 2007 that a law was passed providing for the punishment of slavers. The problem? Hardly anyone is arrested. Complaints simply disappear, judges ignore cases, and the authorities turn a blind eye. Slavery remains entrenched because there is still a very strong social hierarchy, in which certain groups are naturally seen as serfs. Of course, there are movements fighting against this, such as SOS Esclaves and the IRA, Initiative for the Reunion of the Abolitionist Movement, founded by former slaves. They denounce organized protests and put pressure on the authorities. But everything happens slowly and often with reprisals. The most shocking thing is that many of these people can't even imagine a different life. Some have been convinced that this is God's will, others simply see no way out. And so, in the 21st century, Mauritania remains one of the few places where traditional slavery, where one person is considered the property of another, still exists in an explicit form. Number 4. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is known for its oil, futuristic skyscrapers, Mecca, Medina. But behind all this luxury, there is a system called kafala, which has been compared to a form of modern slavery. It works like this. Millions of foreign workers arrive in the country every year, mainly from South Asia and Africa, to work in construction, the service sector, or as domestic servants. But instead of having autonomy, they enter under the patronage of a Saudi employer who controls everything. In many cases, employers confiscate passports, force them to work long hours without rest, delay, or simply don't pay wages. For domestic workers, the situation can be even worse. Many live in conditions of servitude, trapped inside the houses where they work, without days off and at constant risk of physical and psychological abuse. If they try to escape, they are accused of abandoning their jobs, become illegal, and can be deported or imprisoned. In recent years, Saudi Arabia has tried to reform the system and announce changes, such as allowing workers to change jobs without their employer's permission and to leave the country without permission. But in practice, many of these changes still don't work as they should. Abuses continue, and loopholes in the law allow employers to simply circumvent the rules. Number 5. Russia. Moving on down our list, our next destination is now Russia. And at this point, you might be wondering, Russia, do they really have slavery there? Well, no one immediately associates Russia, a power with a turbulent history, with this topic. But the truth is that the largest country in the world in terms of land area has a huge number of migrant workers living in conditions of modern slavery. Many people come from neighboring countries such as Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan looking for work in construction, agriculture, or domestic service. But when they get there, they can end up trapped in trafficking and exploitation schemes. There are countless cases of employers confiscating documents and subjecting people to absurd working hours without pay and under constant surveillance. And if someone dares to complain, they could be threatened with imprisonment, deportation, or, at the very least, being denounced as an illegal immigrant. And the problem gets worse because many corrupt Russian authorities simply turn a blind eye to this reality, or even take bribes to keep everything running. What's more, in the most remote regions of the country, such as Siberia, there are growing reports of forced labor in the timber industry, mining, and even fishing. People who go months without pay, sleep in precarious conditions, and have nowhere to run. Number 6. Afghanistan. Since the Taliban returned to power in 2021, Afghanistan has been plunged into an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. And in this scenario, modern slavery has found even more fertile ground. The most shocking case involves women and girls who are forced to marry Taliban fighters as a reward. To the world, they call it marriage, but in practice, it's slavery. They have no freedom, suffer abuse, and cannot leave their husbands. And the situation doesn't stop there. The economic crisis, the collapse of the government, and widespread hunger have brought entire families to the brink of despair. This means that many accept to exchange work for food or shelter for no pay. Orphaned children, with no schooling and no structure, are recruited by armed groups and forced to become soldiers, slaves, or ammunition carriers. What's worse, there isn't enough international aid because the Taliban has imposed a series of restrictions on NGOs, especially those that employ women. This means that much of the assistance has been cut off, and the victims have become even more invisible. Number 7. Tajikistan. You may never have heard much about Tajikistan, but this small Central Asian country constantly appears in international reports on modern slavery, all thanks to a combination of extreme poverty, lack of enforcement, and a government that turns a blind eye to exploitation. A large part of the population survives on agriculture, and this is where one of the biggest problems comes in: cotton cultivation. Reports indicate that local authorities force entire families to work on the harvest under threat of fines, violence, or even the loss of basic benefits, such as housing and access to public services. In addition, thousands of Tajiks leave the country every year in search of jobs in Russia or Kazakhstan. But many end up falling into human trafficking traps, as we mentioned earlier. Employers confiscate passports, force people to work without pay, and threaten them with false accusations of illegal immigration if they try to escape. The worst thing is that reporting these crimes doesn't solve much. Corruption in the justice system is so great that police officers and judges often protect exploiters in exchange for bribes. The result? Many people are trapped in this system with no way out, no rights, and no hope. Number 8. United Arab Emirates. When people talk about the United Arab Emirates, the image that comes to mind is one of luxury. Imposing skyscrapers, artificial islands, sports cars, and five-star hotels. But behind this millionaire facade, there is a system that imprisons thousands of migrant workers in conditions analogous to slavery. The basis of this problem is the same kafala system we've talked about before. As in Saudi Arabia, foreign workers arrive in the country tied to a single employer who controls their documents, salaries, and even their freedom of movement. What does this mean? Many people arrive believing they will have a better life, but end up without a passport, without pay, and living in overcrowded accommodation, with rationed food and exhausting working hours. Trying to leave? only with permission from the boss, and often that permission never comes. After the conditions of migrant workers were exposed in the media, especially during the Qatar World Cup, the United Arab Emirates promised to make changes. But human rights organizations say that, in practice, almost nothing has changed, and since the country wants to maintain its image as a tourist and business paradise, these abuses are unlikely to disappear overnight. Number 9. Pakistan. Pakistan is one of the countries with the highest numbers of people living in modern slavery, and the main form of this is debt bondage, a trap that entraps entire families for generations. It works like this. A farmer or brick kiln owner lends a family money to survive. The amount may be small at first, but the interest is so absurd that it becomes impossible to repay. As a result, parents and children are forced to work for the rest of their lives to pay off the debt, which, in reality, never ends. There are reports of children who are born owing money and start working from a young age, with no school, no rest, and no prospects. And if they try to escape, their employers send armed security guards to capture them or threaten relatives who have stayed behind. Pakistani law even forbids this kind of exploitation, but the government doesn't monitor it, and corruption keeps it going. In addition to agriculture and brick kilns, the textile industry also takes advantage of this scheme. Despite the difficulties, local and international NGOs try to rescue families from these conditions. But for every group that manages to escape, many others remain trapped in this brutal system of exploitation. Number 10. India. When it comes to modern slavery, India tops the list. This is because the country has the largest absolute number of people living in this condition. There are millions of them, trapped in different forms of exploitation: debt bondage, child labor, the sale of organs, exploitation of various kinds, forced marriages. The list is long. India officially abolished slavery in the 19th century, but in practice the reality remains brutal. Factors such as extreme poverty, caste inequality, and a population of over 1,400,000,000 people make exploitation rampant. Child labor is one of the cruelest aspects. Children who have barely turned 10 are already sewing soccer balls, weaving carpets, or working in mines with no right to study or leisure. Some entire families are forced into agricultural work or brick-making, trapped in a cycle of debt that only grows and never ends. If they try to escape, they end up falling into other exploitative networks or staying on the streets, vulnerable to gangs and begging rings. The government has even created laws to combat this scenario, such as the Right to Education Act and measures against child labor. But enforcement of these laws is weak. Corruption, bureaucracy, and the complicity of many local authorities mean that the problem remains huge. Number 11. Libya. Now for one of today's most shocking and brutal cases. Libya, in North Africa, went through a total collapse after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. The country was plunged into absolute chaos, with armed factions controlling territories, and this created one of the most terrifying slave markets of the 21st century. The big problem began with the migration route. Thousands of people from sub-Saharan Africa try to cross Libya to reach Europe via the Mediterranean. But instead of achieving freedom, they end up trapped in detention centers where they are sold into slavery. Yes, there are human auctions in the country. Men are forced to work in construction, farms, and cleaning without being paid anything. Women are trafficked and exploited, and if anyone tries to escape, they are tortured or killed. In detention centers, conditions are worse than you can imagine. overcrowding, lack of food, and systematic abuse. The UN and other international organizations try to monitor and denounce the situation, but the civil war makes it difficult to take any concrete action. Militias, traffickers, and even local authorities profit from this criminal market, making migrants' lives a living hell. They can't get to Europe, but they can't get back to their countries either. They are trapped in a limbo where they are treated like disposable merchandise. Number 12. China. To close the list, a country that dominates the headlines for its economy, technology, and global influence. But when it comes to human rights, China has a dark side that many prefer to ignore. The biggest controversy in recent years involves the Uyghurs, a Muslim minority in the Xinjiang region. According to various reports by NGOs and foreign governments, hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs have been sent to re-education camps. What happens in these places? Forced labor, constant surveillance, and political indoctrination. In other words, a system of modern slavery controlled by the state. Then there are the working conditions in Chinese factories. Despite some reforms, there are reports of exhausting working hours, withholding of wages, and even violence to ensure productivity. Migrant workers from the countryside are especially vulnerable. Without urban residency registration, the famous hukou system, they have no access to basic services and are trapped in exploitative jobs. Another alarming problem is the trafficking of women for forced marriage. With decades of the one-child policy, China ended up creating an imbalance between men and women. Now, traffickers kidnap or trick women from neighboring countries, such as Vietnam, Myanmar, and Cambodia, promising them a better life. But when they get there, they discover that they have been sold as wives and are imprisoned without the right to escape. The Chinese government denies the accusations and restricts any independent investigation. But the accusations continue to surface, proving that behind the economic powerhouse lies a dark reality of systematic exploitation. See how, unfortunately, slavery is not a thing of the past? And did you know that all this was still happening so strongly in the 21st century? Tell us in the comments which fact surprised you the most. If you liked this content, you already know. Leave a like, subscribe to Bello Mundo, and activate the bell so you don't miss any new videos. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you next time.